Of all the arcs in One Piece, Wano holds more potential Straw Hat candidates than any other island the Straw Hats have ever visited. Speculation has run wild, with over a dozen people being considered as possibilities at one point or another. So, who will join? I'm not going to say outright, though I have made it clear in the past what my suspicions are. Instead, today, let's look back at the past, at every speculated character in One Piece, and see who joined and who didn't. Then, in 2 weeks, we'll release a video applying the information we've gone over in this video to the current Straw Hat candidates. That way, we might get a better view of which ones are actually viable candidates. We're waiting 2 weeks, of course, because next week we are going to be choosing a winner for our One Piece trivia contest. If you are interested in proving that you are a true One Piece fan, you still have a few days to apply, so check the description of this video for a link to that one. Now, I hope you like speculating about speculation, because the question of who will join Luffy's crew first arose before the widespread use of the internet. Hence, collecting accurate data about early One Piece speculation is near impossible. However, as I'll explain in a moment, that shouldn't be a huge issue. July 1997 was the first chapter of One Piece, which was only about a year after Internet Explorer was invented, and definitely before I had internet in my house. To make things harder, the One Piece manga wasn't formally translated into English until the middle of Skypiea. The English anime that drew most of the older English-speaking One Piece fans into the fold didn't air until Water 7. So, while English-speaking viewers like myself could have had our guesses as we were reading the series, a lot was already spoiled for us. I'll talk about that later. So, most of the English speculation online about the series would come from people well aware of everyone who would join or not join the crew up until Nico Robin. Basically, this has all just been a big disclaimer that while big online forums like Arlang Park and the creatively named One Piece manga came along to document speculation and theories in about 2003, most of the speculation from before that was made by Japanese kids on the playground and therefore has been lost to time. But still, for fun, let's speculate about what those kids may have thought back in the day while reading this pirate manga. For the East Blue, as I said, that should be relatively easy to do, as the recruitment strategy employed there was pretty straightforward. Basically, it went like this: get to island, meet a person, ask them to join, save their something, leave with new friend. When the story kicks off, Luffy hears about a strong man he should recruit from two different people, basically the only other two named characters at this point, one of which has a dream which runs opposite to Luffy's, and the other one is an unattractive antagonist that no one would have wanted on the crew anyway. So, Luffy goes to recruit this strong swordsman and meets some other unlikable antagonists and a little girl. No one else is even named. And of course, it wasn't until recently that people started considering little kids viable candidates for the crew. So up until this point, speculation was unlikely. Then Luffy and Zoro get lost. They state that they need a navigator and they immediately meet one. And this is where the trend I mentioned earlier was set in the reader's mind. Not to mention that back then very few named characters were introduced, a stark difference from the countless gifters, Coliseum fighters, and Charlottes we've met. So honestly, back then there weren't a lot of options to speculate about. Then the trio arrive at Gaimon's island. If anyone believed he was going to join the crew, and I know some did, their belief was dashed by the end of the chapter, so I would hardly call that speculation. Once we get to Syrup Village, Usopp quickly solidified his position in his introductory chapter when he offered to join the crew. Sort of. And then, shortly thereafter, when you find out his dad was on Shanks' crew, there was no more question. He was going to be the character to join this arc. Next, we get to the Brodier, and maybe, just maybe, some may have considered Zeph an option, but the second chapter of the arc has Luffy straight up declaring Sanji is going to be his cook. Then we get to Arlong Park, where things start to get interesting for the first time. Why? Well, despite the fact that the arc's intentions are clearly stated to be the retrieval of a crewmate, the possibility of another joining is always on the table. Now, I highly doubt anyone believed a member of the Arlong Pirates would join, as Oda did a pretty good job of painting them as very evil. Aside from them, there was only Nojiko, Genzo, and Shaba. And while I imagine that someone out there considered the idea that Nami's sister Nojiko would join the crew, I've never heard anyone actually suggest that idea. So, what makes this arc our first interesting bit of speculation? Well, we've had these two admittedly amusing dudes, Johnny and Yosako, sailing with a crew for some time. Would they continue with the Straw Hats? What would be their place in the story? As you well know, the answer to both of these questions is no and none, respectively. But back in the day, the fact that they were left behind came as a bit of a surprise to many. The art of advanced Straw Hat candidate studies wasn't a thing back then, so many thought, hey, those guys are pretty cool, let's let them join. After we leave Arlong Park with Luffy declaring Nami to be their navigator officially, we arrive at Logue Town, or as most of us English speakers knew it growing up, Rogue Town. The island was only in the manga very briefly, and aside from spooky Deus Ex Machina hooded man and the creepy looking shopkeeper, every named character here was a clear antagonist. It wouldn't be until long after this that fans began to speculate about the possibility of Buggy, Smoker, and Toshigi joining the crew. Buggy is not often talked about, but he is occasionally the subject of speculation, due to the fact that in the one-shot of One Piece, there was a character named Crescent Moon Galley. At the end of the one-shot, this character ends up joining Luffy's crew. When One Piece moved to official release, Buggy replaced that character, leading some to believe that his eventual fate was to be on Luffy's crew. We'll talk about Smoker and Toshigi later though. Once we enter the Grand Line, Luffy asks the first person they see to be his doctor. That person says no, of course, but surely some fans may have ended the chapter believing Crocus would join the crew. The two members of Team Rocket they met in the whale? Well, I doubt anyone believed they would join at this point. What a twist we encountered though, when in the next chapter, Crocus was left behind and the Doofy agents sailed away with the crew. Short-lived speculation, if there ever was any, but I figured I'd bring it up. With that, we enter a curious era that no doubt confused a lot of the fans who were expecting more of the whole one crew member an island thing to continue, since the next two islands have 0 characters that could logically join the crew. In Whiskey Peak, everyone wanted to kill the crew. When we finally learned the truth about Vivi, it seemed like the crew would just be dropping her off at Alabasta after they helped her, and there was no way that that lady who killed Igaram would ever be a part of the crew. In Little Garden, we only met 4 new people, 2 of which are the antagonists, and the other 2 couldn't physically fit on the boat. Once again, I've never heard of anyone speculating that anyone here would have joined. We get to Drum Island, where the speculation begins anew. We need a doctor at this point, but something strange happens first. Some people have told me that this is when Vivi started to feel like a part of the crew to them. Between her interaction with Luffy and her time with Usopp, she just began to fit in. Of course, there were also those who suspected Dalton as well, and can you blame them? He's just so cool. After all, it wasn't until chapter 139, well into the arc, that the crew even met any doctors that could join the crew. And in 140, Luffy starts begging Kureha to join the crew, really dismissing any logical reason someone would suspect Dalton of joining next. But honestly, I wouldn't know, since someone already told me Chopper would join before I started Drum Island. Not that it would have mattered much, as 140 is also when Nami invites Chopper to join the crew. Now, I don't know how long or even if theories of Dalton and Kureha joining the crew persisted past that moment, but I'm certain that no other candidate stood out until the end of the arc, when Chopper sails off with the crew and Vivi, leaving the others behind. At this point, we meet Mr. 2, and while some people did speculate that he may join the crew during the Impel Down arc, the idea that an antagonist of this caliber would join the crew was unheard of, and hence, I don't think he had any supporters back in Alabasta. If I am wrong, and you thought he would join back then, let me know down in the comments. Once we finally do reach Alabasta, the Vivi train really starts to pick up steam, especially after the fight between Vivi and Luffy. Most people were somewhat firm in the belief that she would be the character joining in this arc, with of course Karoo by her side. Now mind you, that doesn't mean she was the only considered candidate. Oddly enough, some people did have the passing suspicion that Ace would join the crew, but anyone who is an older sibling would have known that that just can't happen. An older sibling would never join their little brother's crew. And it was towards the end of the Alabasta arc that certain select members of the community started to believe that Smoker and Toshigi could very well have a place on the crew, but obviously not now. That would happen in the distant future. We actually still have yet to see if they will be right or wrong, and Smoker joining the crew is still a popular theory down to this day. This is largely based on the idea that Luffy seems to be reshaping Smoker's views on who the good guys are and what actual justice is. The obvious endpoint to Smoker's character journey is pretty clearly laid out for us narratively, and I don't think anyone disagrees with the idea that Smoker will be on Luffy's side by the end of the story. Does that mean that Smoker will take on the mantle of pirate and join Luffy's crew? Well, that's the big question left for the story to answer. How far is Smoker really willing to follow Luffy? Back on the Vivi subject, ironically, I never thought that the Straw Hat Pirate's journey to Alabasta was anything more than an escort mission, but that was just personal speculation. It wasn't until the very end of Alabasta that I even considered that Vivi would want to leave her home country with them. And of course, she didn't. Now that doesn't mean Vivi's speculation has ever truly vanished though. There have always been people who believed she would rejoin the crew at some point. and their sentiment has been strengthened by recent chapters which reveal a tragic event has befallen Alabasta. Will Vivi need to escape into the protective arms of the Pirate King crew? That all depends on what exactly happened in Alabasta and who died at Reverie, as many suspect Cobra was the fatality here. Once again, the possibility of her joining is still on the table. Despite the fact that we sailed away from Alabasta without Vivi, we still got a new crewmate in Nico Robin, one that no one suspected. With that, Robin opened the floodgates, as from this point on, no one could be completely ruled out. Now, I've never seen someone mention the idea that they thought Cricket or the monkeys would join Luffy's crew, and by the time we find out the guy eating pie's name, we also find out that he is this background antagonist called Blackbeard we've heard so much about. So I don't think there was much speculation in Jaya, especially since we just got a new crew member. Perhaps people had started to cool down with the speculation at this point after how infrequent the crew additions were in the Alabasta saga. In Sky Island, however, we did have one suspect, and that is Wiper. As someone who has been tracking Straw Hat speculation for some time, I was surprised not to see any evidence of people believing Conus or Asia were candidates. After all, usually all someone needs to be considered a potential crewmate is to be a girl. However, since Nico Robin had just joined, I think a lot of people were expecting to get a boy again. It is a shonen manga after all. Going back to Wiper though, I don't think a lot of people strongly believed he would join. They were just looking for a crewmate in this arc. He was quite antagonistic and really was only considered a possibility because Skypiea was so long and he was actually pretty cool. After falling from the sky with no new crewmates in tow, it becomes abundantly clear to the Straw Hats that they need a shipwright to fix the ship. Thankfully, we immediately run into a game that lets you win new crew members. Nonetheless, not many people saw anyone on Foxy's crew as potential Straw Hat material. Most of them were ugly, or too big, or just not interesting enough. And if you watch the anime, it basically sets it up so no one would join from the start. Plus, a lot of people believed that this would have been a very cheap way to get a new crewmate, and disliked the idea of anyone joining this way. But if you thought someone from Longring Island was going to join the crew, let me know down in the comments. After sailing from there, Luffy directly stated that he was going to be looking for his next crewmate on Water 7, so expectations were high. We were definitely getting a new crewmate soon. Of course, Iceberg was a possibility, but the 2-page spread in chapter 323 seemed to be our menu of choices. Would we get Lucci, Polly, Lulu, Pileston, Kaku? No, I said Kaku. Now from this point on, I was personally able to chronicle the fan speculation about the next Straw Hat pirate, so no more secondhand information from now on, promise. Polly was the one out of the different shipwrights available in Water 7 that quickly rose to be a fan favorite for the next crew member, especially when we found out Kaku and Lucci were evil. Polly was going to team up with Luffy to take down the traitors, so it made sense for a very short while. When Frankie had his heart-to-heart with Usopp, people started to consider this unlikely candidate a possibility, especially since he was apparently a shipwright too. The two of them were fiercely debated for a while, with some people considering the idea of co-shipwrights, so everyone would be happy. This continued up until Frankie burned the plans for Pluton and joined the crew in their one-on-one battles with the CP9, while Polly faded into obscurity. At this point, the Polly hype began to fizzle out as Frankie emerged as the clear and only option for the next crewmate. After this, we are immediately thrust into Thriller Bark, where Luffy immediately asks Brook to join the crew. I think the fact that Luffy subsequently went on to ask every creature in Thriller Bark to join was Oda's way of making us doubt if Brook would actually join or not, and a lot of people were fooled into believing Brook was not a surefire pick. Also, since the last crewmate to join, Frankie, was indeed a man, Thriller Bark started the ongoing trend that has continued to this day of every single female being considered a highly likely candidate. Now, Thriller Bark did not have a lot of good picks, as we did quickly learn that most of the people there are zombies, and Law and Order SVU villain Absalom was absolutely not going to join the crew. So, all eyes were on Perona. They should have been on Brook, but he has no eyes. Yo. Anyway, to this day, I don't know why Perona was such a popular pick, aside from, girl, but she continued to be considered a viable candidate, all the way up until the Straw Hats ditched her in Saubari Archipelago, after the time skip when they went to Fishman Island. Even for a brief time on the way down to Fishman Island, there was still speculation that she had snuck aboard somehow. Speaking of the archipelago, that was our next destination. But before we got there, we met up with Cammy and Hachi again. While no one talked about Hachin joining the crew, a lot of people liked the idea of Cammy being on the crew as a scout, because, who doesn't want a mermaid as a crewmate? Once we actually got to the archipelago, the new characters we met were the 11 supernovas. Well, we met 9 new ones. And obviously, none of them were considered possible crewmates, right? They were supposed to be Luffy's rivals, so it would have been silly to consider any of them to be possible allies. Aside from Bonnie, of course. She saved Zoro. I mean, if she doesn't join, she'll at least be an ally, right? I'm telling you, it was every single girl from Thriller Bark on. In the meantime, Cammy hype hit a climax when the crew went to go save her from the auction house. But that hype quickly died after Kuma sent the crew flying around the globe. I mean, Luffy ended up on the island of women. And there, we met Margaret, who saved Luffy and basically guaranteed herself a spot on the crew, right? After all, if anyone was going to join an Amazon Lily, it had to be her. This idea stuck around for a while, and I'm pretty sure she was a popular choice until Luffy sailed off with Hancock to save Ace. Interestingly, Hancock was never a very popular choice, largely because of the clear disinterest Luffy had in her. Plus, the fact that many brought up she would likely kill Nami and Robin out of jealousy, and kill Sanji and Brook just for existing. I would be lying though if I said she was never brought up in Nakama discussion, but Oda did a pretty good job of making it clear she was not Mugiwara material, so most fans dismissed her as an option. When we got to Impel Down, Luffy gained a lot of new allies, yet surprisingly, very few of them were considered by the fandom at large possibilities for the crew. As I stated earlier, Mr. 2 was considered a possibility by some, but the rest of the people in the arc, with the exception of Jinbei and Ivankov, were pretty clearly not Luffy's friends. And Ivankov, well, no one thought he had a place on the ship. It is because of that Jinbei suddenly began to seem like a viable option for the next crew member, and he continued to solidify his potential in each subsequent arc. I don't remember when it was that I started to believe Jinbei would join, but by the time Luffy asked him on Fishman Island, I had long been on the Jinbei hype train myself. Of course, I think a lot of people started to have their doubts when Oda made us wait over 300 chapters for him to actually become an official member, but it is good to have him finally on the crew and have the debate finally put to rest. Jumping back a little bit, when the crew was finally safely reunited after the 2-year time skip, there was some joking speculation that Caribou would join, but that would never happen. Unless, I mean, he is in Wano now. Anyway, on Fishman Island, I'm sure Shirahoshi would have been considered a potential candidate if she could fit on the ship, but alas, she was much too large. As an interesting side note, talk of Cammy joining the crew didn't really seem to resurface despite her prominent place in this arc. Now, while Punk Hazard did not have a lot of new crew member speculation, despite the fact that Luffy was on an invitation spree again, we did get a few new sailing buddies in the form of Momo, Kinemon, Law, and Caesar. At this point, everyone hated Momo, but talk of Kinemon joining the crew would surface here and there starting around this time, and while the community would occasionally joke about Caesar joining, absolutely no one seriously believed either that he or Law would join at this point. In fact, most suspected Law would betray the crew at some point. He did seem to be hiding something after all. Sailing on from Punk Hazard, we arrive in Dressrosa, and the floodgates open. With what was by far the longest arc in the series at this point, paired with the gigantic number of new characters, many of which quickly became allies, there was no way we weren't getting a new crew member here, right? Despite the number of people who were brought up, none of them really seemed to tick all the boxes, and no one agreed on who was a good choice and who was not. After all, with the exception of Robin, every other new addition to the crew was pretty heavily foreshadowed, with things like Luffy stating they would join, a sad backstory that tied into the arc's narrative, or the fact that Luffy sailed to the island specifically for that person. Despite this, the following people were considered at varying points. 1. Kenjuro. Kenjuro was always a, if Kinemon joins, maybe Kanjuro will join with him, kind of deal. I don't think anyone really wanted just Kanjuro to join, and while that idea sort of hung around for a while, that has certainly been put to rest by now, face down in the snow to be specific. Personally, I always saw these two as the Johnny and Yosaku of the New World, so I never counted on them joining. Then, of course, everyone thought Violet would join. Can you guess why? A lot of people thought that this may have been Sanji's chance at a girlfriend who could join and temper his overwhelming personality. Plus, the term scout came up again, as well as lookout, since her abilities lend themselves to aiding with long-distance sight. Kairos and Rebecca were also both considered, and at the very least, they did both get a sad backstory that tied in with the arc. Rebecca was considered a possibility early, as she was an ally from the beginning. Kairos was a less popular opinion, but man, would that have been cool. Surprisingly, these two were never talked about as a package deal, as some speculated characters were in the past. I guess the people who wanted Kairos and the people who wanted Rebecca were very different types of people. Now, I'm sure a lot of the various allies were brought up in conversation, but only 3 of the eventual Grand Fleet members actually gained any popularity as options, and those are Barto, Wicca, and Leo. Wicca and Leo were considered because I think a lot of people wanted a Tantata crewmate, once again to fill that scout role, and these 2 were the ones that had the most interactions with the crew. Barto, on the other hand, wasn't as seriously considered. He seemed like a very poor choice for the crew, but his obsession with them gave people pause and made them wonder if he would try to gain a spot on the ship. Of course, when all of these people with weird places as pseudo-allies in the story became part of the Grand Fleet, everything made sense. It also opened up another point of discussion. Who will join the Grand Fleet? Will more crews come under the label? Many people believe this will be it, while others believe that the Grand Fleet will continue to grow. Of course, we'll talk about that later. Lastly, in Dressrosa, there was Bellamy. Bellamy was a strong candidate for a spot on the crew. Despite his conviction during his and Luffy's fight, he actually continued to be considered as a possible crewmate after separating from the crew, all the way up till we saw where he retired in the Land of Dyed Goods. Once we got to Zhao, Wanda immediately stood out as a fan favorite. I can't imagine why. But with the shocking reveal that Carrot was indeed the one who was going with the crew to Whole Cake Island, Wanda was forgotten in favor of the bunny. Now, Carrot has continued to be a strong contender for the crew, as she has sailed with them for a while and did have a traumatic event in her past of seeing her mentor explode in front of her. Plus, she does really want to see the world. Surprisingly, Pedro was never really brought up as a serious contender for a place on the crew. I guess everyone just saw him as a temporary guide. Once we got to Whole Cake Island, there was only one clear option: Pudding. Only Pudding. Of course, Jinbei continued to solidify his place as a member all the way up to the end, where it was basically confirmed that he was joining the crew, but early on, Pudding was a serious contender. After all, Luffy did propose the idea that if Sanji married her, she could just become one of the crewmates. So, up until the reveal that she was evil, we all wanted her in the crew. Yes, that includes me. What? I wanted Sanji to be happy. After Whole Cake is the Reverie arc. And surprisingly, there was crew member speculation there too, despite the lack of any of the actual Straw Hat crew. Yes, Princess Vivi got to be in the spotlight once again, with, as I said earlier, many now feeling quite assured that she would return to the crew in the next few arcs. And finally, that brings us to Wano. In this arc, our first contender was Tama, the little girl who asked Luffy to take her out to sea with him. She doesn't have a lot of evidence supporting her joining, but fans of her do cite the fact that Roger had kids on his crew. Besides, her usefulness in this arc cannot be understated. I've noticed that most of the people who want Tama want her as a 2-for-1 deal with Momo. I'm quite surprised that so many people did a 180 and actually want the pervy imp on the crew now. Since the last Pirate King had Odin on his crew, many believe the next Pirate King should have Odin's son on the crew. Though with Odin back now, maybe we'll get Odin on the crew. Who knows? Now, I also do recall Speed being brought up, but I'm not sure if that was a joke or not. On a side note, I'm surprised that Kiku was never seen as a possible candidate, but I think she seemed too fishy to be considered initially. And then, Kiku just became one of many scabbards, so any chance at possible interest was lost. For the same reason, a lot of interest in Kinemon has been lost too. I also think a lot of people who believed he would join now believe he will die, so there's that. Unsurprisingly, when Ulti was first introduced, it looked like people were swaying towards wanting her to join, but she was immediately overshadowed by Yamato. Yamato quickly pulled into first place for a lot of people due to 3 prominent reasons, one of which being that she actually just asked Luffy to join the crew, immediately. Luffy did not seem keen on the idea right away, but the reason why is clearly the unresolved issues with Yamato, which will be resolved before Luffy sets sail. Will that mean she joins them? It's hard to say, but the chemistry these two have is undeniable. Then, of course, we come back to Law, who has really strengthened his chances this arc by giving himself a dream that requires him to keep sailing with Luffy. Although, despite this, I'm really the only one who thinks he'll join. So, which of these fine candidates do you think will join? Join us next time as we analyze what we've learned from our analysis of the history of One Piece crew member speculation and compare it to the possible candidates in the Wano arc.
Yo!
Gaigo, Gaigo! Hey there!
Don't leave without subbing.
Hey there!
Don't leave without liking.
Hey there!
Don't forget to comment. Hit the bell, hit the bell, hit the bell.